How's it going, guys? Welcome back to the Black Metal Rebellion. I'm your host, Jesse Morgan, aka Slammerella, and today we have a review to do, this time on a thrash band called Hazzerd. This is their second album. It was released in January 17th of this year, 2020. A lot of you guys ended up getting a copy through the Metalhead box. So did I. I had to approach them personally and ask for a copy because I'm a huge fan of Hazzerd, and the shipping prices from Amazon and the Bandcamp to Canada were a little bit more than I was willing to pay for. So once again, the Metalhead box comes through and luckily was able to get me a copy for a fair price, and thank you guys for doing so. Really glad that there was an extra copy available. So anywho, once again, this is their 2020 second album called Delirium, and if you don't know, they are once again a thrash band from Alberta, Canada. Before this album, they also had a 2017 release called Misleading Evil, and prior to that they had an EP called Victimize the Innocent in 2014. The members consist of Dylan Westendorp on drums and vocals, Brandon Malicki on guitars, Torin Shadlik on lead guitars, and David Sprague on bass. So let's talk about all of the instruments on here, and then we'll get to my general thoughts and favorite tracks. So starting with the vocals, they are about mid to high in the mix, about on par with the guitars, sometimes being slightly lower in parts. They are performed well and consistently overall. They are a raspy, kind of aggressive thrash style, which you'd expect on a thrash metal release. And the vocals also have the reverb and gain or distortion effects on them that was also present on the first album, Misleading Evil. Besides that, I find that it kind of gives it a futuristic sounding effect to it. They almost have a kind of what I call the Son of Mustaine feel, kind of like a more youthful, talented version of Dave Mustaine vocals, aka vocals that I would actually listen to. There's also the odd sprinkling of different elements in there with like the odd high-pitched kind of dissonant scream, and there's even a cool little creepy semi-growly segment in the song Illuminating Truth, so that was kind of neat. Overall, pretty decent vocals. Now, the guitars were about mid to high level in the mix, mostly on the louder range, sometimes slightly eclipsing the vocals, however. The tone was great, crunchy, and buzzing. The leads were ripping and just wild. The guitars were performed incredibly, every note seemingly pitch perfect, and the riffs and leads were just aplenty in this album. There was just riffs and leads galore. Every minute seemed jam-packed, filled with insane talent. So props to the guitarists Torin and Brendan. Let's talk about the bass a bit. It was mixed just below the guitars and the drums, probably slightly just below the vocals as well at times, but sometimes on par with the vocals. The bass in this album was very prevalent. It was very articulate and definitely was very involved with the songs. It added quite a bit of flavor and spice to the overall composition as well. It went well above and beyond just kind of providing the low end to the album. It had its own voice in there. It added some really cool elements to the songs and composition. It even stood out in a couple of places, particularly hinted at the end of the track, A Tormented Reality, and the intro on Victim of a Desperate Mind. So really cool. There's also a couple other songs where it kind of is featured in the middle too by itself and has its own time to shine. So they definitely didn't skimp on giving the bass player his 15 minutes of fame. Well, let's move on to the drums. They were mixed fairly high, yet was still mostly on par with the guitars. You can kind of tell that Dylan favors his drumming over his vocals, but for good reason. The drumming is fantastic. It has a driving, momentous energy, crazy fills, gallops, cymbal work, timing, and definitely nails the groove and pace throughout the album. And also, I noticed that it has a kind of very unique and cool snare sound as well. You don't really hear it. It's got an echoey kind of reverb, kind of pong to it, not so trash canny that it sounds like something off of Saint Anger, but also not really crisp and snappy either. So it's got that kind of balance in between, and once again kind of has that like slightly far away sound, but isn't like low volume in the mix, so it's still able to be heard quite well, and adds that nice accent to the beats. All right, with all that being said and out of the way, let's talk about some of my favorite tracks. The first track on the album, Sacrifice Them in the Name of God, kind of reminds me of a track off of the new Drakir album that I have called Cross Contamination for Lyrics. But anyways, this track is a perfect representation and a sneak peek of what you're going to get for the rest of the album. So that definitely had to be added to my favorite tracks list on this release, and it really sets you up for what's going to come in the rest of the tracks. The other favorite track that I had off of this album was Sanctuary for the Mad. It has absolutely insane and epic leads, and it has energy out of the ass. So if you want something that pumps you up, really gets you going, gets that head banging, track 3, Sanctuary for the Mad, will definitely do that for you. Next is track number 6, Dead in the Shed. It seemed to, for whatever reason, every time I put this album on, pop up and kind of stick out to me. It had this kind of really neat dead chant in it. He would just be like, dead, dead, dead. And I don't know, I liked it. It's simple and really drove the point home, and was kind of neat. The song had some crazy groovy riffs in it to it, and it got your head banging, and definitely something that stuck out to me. I couldn't quite make out every single bit of the lyrics, but from what I caught, it was a very tongue-in-cheek kind of anti-hard drug kind of song, and they kind of call this Bob guy a dumbass for ODing on LSD or something in the song. And as a person that's kind of an anti-hard drug advocate, and I've seen too many friends and heard too many horror stories of friends in the scene either ODing or doing really ridiculous shit while high, or just drugs kind of turning them into like a mindless zombie of their former self. So if that's what the song's hinting at, that's a big thumbs up for me. Huge respect for Hazzerd if that's what they're talking about in the song. And the possibly most favorite song on this entire album, and one of the more stick out ones in comparison to the rest of the composition and mood that it sets, is track number 8, Waking Nightmare. This one had a very haunting and atmospheric intro, had some moody and heavy hitting riffs, definitely the darkest song on the release, and had some pretty sick bass lines if I don't say so. Just really good composition, a nice kind of stick out track amongst the rest of the hard hitting kind of fast energy driven songs with mostly kind of like a fun atmosphere. This one gets a little dark, this one gets a little creepy, this one gets kind of heavy, and really kind of hints at something that these guys could use in their career going forward. Also, once again, with the whole Megadeth theme that I'm kind of picking up from this track itself kind of had my Darkest Hour vibe to it for Megadeth. I don't know if that was intentional or if it's just something that I'm coming up with in my own headcanon for this release, but yeah, it definitely had those kind of vibes to it. So those are my favorite tracks, with number 8 being the top of my favorite tracks list because of its standout and different tone and just crazy riffs. Let's talk about my overall thoughts about this album. Hazzerd, from what I've seen, utilize every single tool a thrasher has in their belt and beyond. They're kind of the answer to all of the old heads out there asking if modern thrash has anything to offer the genre going forward. Yes, it does, and Hazzerd is the name. Delirium kind of picks off in my mind where Killing Is My Business left off. It has that very youthful Dave Mustaine kind of sound to the vocals. It has more talent in my opinion, and the leads and the riffs are just as cool and inventive and crazy as some of the early Megadeth albums. The composition and style was just something that the modern thrash metal scene needed. If there's one thrash band to convert anyone, it's Hazzerd. If you're in black metal, if you're into death metal, if you're into power metal, if you're into folk metal, and you want a band that's going to be like, hey, what's thrash about? Hey, do I have to dig into the 80s? This is what it's about. No, you don't have to dig into the 80s. They've got the riffs, they've got the energy, they've got the talent, and they've got the creativity. Hazzerd is the answer. Now, without kissing too much more of their ass, there are a couple of improvements that I could think of when going forward with the band. That being the vocals could have less of that echoey reverb distortion gain effect on it that was also prevalent in Misleading Evil. So I think in the future it'd be cool if he kind of dropped those kind of like effects that distorted his vocals and give a more raw performance and kind of make it more of the forefront of the album, and not kind of be afraid to make it stand out, because it seems like he's just kind of like pulling it down in the mix a little bit so that the guitars and the drums are the forefront. But don't worry, man, your vocals seem to be good enough that it doesn't need to have those extra effects on it, and it seems like they could shine. You just got to give them the chance and perhaps put some production into it outside of effects. Like I know reverb's fine. Every band uses reverb in their vocals for the most part. It doesn't need to be quite that much, and the gain or distortion or whatever effect you're putting on top of that, in my opinion, doesn't need to be there, because I feel that the vocals are good enough to stand on their own. Speaking of vocals, I feel like if there's a little bit more diversity add to them, that would be cool as well. Like you were hinting at in the song Illuminating Truth, those growly-ish kind of creepier vocals, that would be cool to see pop up more here and there, as well as the long drawn-out screams that you had in there. Not quite the long power metal screams that some thrash metal bands do, but like the more testing the limits of your vocals type. Besides that, I also feel like more darker tracks like Waking Nightmare could be a benefit to the band going forward, because when I heard that track and I saw the difference from the other tracks that are a little more high energy and a little bit more lighter tone, this one really hit home and really added some punch to the rest of the album. So that was cool. I enjoyed that. I forgot to kind of talk about the song on here, Call of the Void. It's the instrumental track that there's no vocals. I think Classy Lonnie touched on it a bit in his review, or when he was talking about the album. And what Lonnie said was that you could put this on and play it for hours in the background while you're either cleaning up a room or working on something. And he's right. Like the instrumental track, Call of the Void, really is something that you could just press play, put on repeat, and just have playing in the background and be very satisfying while you're working away at something. So with all that said and done, I'm gonna have to give Hazzerd's second album, Delirium, a solid 9 out of 10. It was really, really good. This is just as good or better than the first Hazzerd album. I would say my favorite release is still probably Victimizing the Innocent, just because of the raw nature of it, just because of how the vocals were presented on that one. I prefer those type of vocals over the album style that's going on here. But for the albums, this is really, really good. Once again, 9 out of 10. If you're looking to get into thrash, Hazzerd is where it's at, my guys, especially if you're a fan of old school 80s stuff like early Megadeth. The guitarists in this really pull off the shredding and the melody and the thrash power chord riffs, but for the modern audience. And all you old heads that think there's no way any modern thrash band can pull off anything as good as the 80s, well, maybe put aside your biases and check out Delirium. Anywho, that's it. I'm Jesse Morgan, and I did buy this album. Please check it out. That's it. For Glory, for the Rebel Alliance, Slammerella out.